Good morning, everyone. My name's Lucy. I head up the consultancy team for Frankham Risk Management. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We're actually a bit overwhelmed by the response that we've had. And actually, we had to cap the number of people that we could have on this webinar because we didn't want teams to explode. So we will be planning a second one. We've got some great speakers today. My job really is just to give a broad level overview of the draft building safety bill, some of the key changes, but ultimately I'm going to allow our speakers to fill in the gaps. So it's worth noting at this stage that the building safety bill is still in draft form. It went out to public comment and that closed in October last year. So it's expected that a lot of the ideas for reform will be taken on board, and a lot of what we're saying is what it will ultimately look like in fruition. There may be some slight changes, and I think we'll remember that based on Hackett's initial review, she was setting up this joint competency authority. That was with the local authority building control, the fire safety enforcing authority, and HSE as one entity. And we've actually moved away from that to the HSE to be the building safety regulator. So that's just an example of a change that could happen, although ultimately it's unlikely to be such a large change at this late stage. So I'm just going to look at the who, what, why, when, where, and how we ultimately got to where we are. There's 5 parts of the building safety bill. It's quite difficult to read, if I'm honest with you. The explanatory notes are much easier to digest, and actually it's somewhat easier if we first of all look at Hackett's ideas for reform, and then you work backwards and you can see some context and where these ideas have come from. Part 2 of the bill establishes this new building safety regulator, and that, as I've just touched on, will be set up by the Health and Safety Executive. And HSE actually this week have announced that Peter Baker will be the new Chief Inspector of Buildings. Part 3 deals with amendments to the Building Act. Now, we're going to look at this, but it's introducing this high-risk building, which is at the moment a multi-occupied premises over 18 metres. And there's going to be amendments to the Building Act to the extent that this won't be looked after by local authority building control anymore. This will be looked after by the Building Safety Regulator. Part 4 is concerned with high-risk buildings and what they are, but also it places duties on the accountable person and the building safety manager, and this is another 2 key terms that we'll look at shortly. Part 5 is introducing a new Homes Ombudsman, provisions for construction products, and a committee for industry competency. There's particular regard to architects, but also it's looking at ensuring the competency of anyone working in a building or carrying out surveys such as fire risk assessors. So why we're doing it is ultimately in reaction to the fire at Grenfell Tower. And I'm sure everybody's aware, on the 14th of June 2017, a fire broke out at Grenfell Tower. This was a 24-storey residential tower block with combustible cladding to the external facade. The fire started on the 4th floor and quickly spread throughout the building, and it took 24 hours for firefighters to bring that fire under control. This building was built on a stay put policy, which meant that residents were asked to remain in the building. Because it had a stay put policy, the building was designed with a single staircase, and the idea was that if a fire originated in a flat, this would be contained for up to 60 minutes. The compartmentation of the building should have been such that at most other flats on the fire floor would need to evacuate. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case. The smoke control system for the building also would have been designed based on the premise that a fire would occur in a single flat, and it would not have accounted for the fire load that occurred at Grenfell. There were a series of other failings in the building, such as insufficient emergency lighting and fire doors which were found to last 15 minutes instead of 30. Now, these were GRP composite doors, and I'm sure if anybody's read the consolidated advice note, they'll see the additional guidance that came out post-Grenfell. The fire resulted in the deaths of 72 people, and it was the greatest loss of life in a residential fire since the Second World War. So following this incident, and rightly so, the government commissioned Dame Judith Hackett to carry out an independent review. Now, this is a real key quote from Hackett, because she didn't just look at fire safety, but building safety as a whole. So what she said was, it's most definitely not just a question of the specification of cladding systems, but of an industry that's not reflected and learned from itself, nor looked to other sectors. Now, Hackett was actually criticised post-2017 after her initial review for not immediately banning combustible cladding on buildings. Hackett turned around and said, well, ultimately, I'm not an expert. That's not my area of expertise. And she instead decided to consider on building safety as a whole. And actually, we've had a much greater outcome because her regulations for reform are much greater than if she had just focused on cladding. As we all know, in 2018, the government brought in a ban of combustible materials on buildings over 18 metres. So ultimately, we've now achieved both standards. So what did she initially find? So she said that there was a lot of ignorance. Regulations and guidance are not always read by those who should, and if they are, they're often not followed or misunderstood. There was this motivation across the industry to do things quickly and cheaply, which in turn has driven down safety standards with an increase in design and build schemes. And we've got that phrase, race to the bottom, that was coined by Hackett. The improvements with regards to accountability are needed and better regulation, which is what we're going to see shortly with this new building safety regulator and also new key duty holders. The main outcomes were to create a more effective regulatory and accountability framework, introduce clearer standards and guidance, and put residents at the heart of the system. Now, actually at Grenfell, some of the residents had raised safety issues within the building, and unfortunately they fell on deaf ears at the time. So we're trying to learn lessons from Grenfell in a way that maybe we didn't post Lacanau. We're looking to increase transparency and introduction of building assurance certificates. Now, I sat on a lot of focus groups following Grenfell, and this is what people were asked for. We were looking for this gas safety style certificate or building safety rating, and ultimately that's going to be brought forward with the certification. But also it's more than that. So we're looking at cultural change, more responsibility across the building industry as a whole. In fire safety, we've definitely seen this, and I think we've all moved towards a place of saying, well, actually, there's enough work to go around. All consultancies should support and help each other. I've just put this slide on there because it's really key to identify that the fire safety bill and the building safety bill are two different documents. This is just an excerpt from the fire safety bill, which is a much smaller piece of legislation. And the key outcome from that bill is that it redefines the application of premises within the fire safety order. So there was some confusion or debate within industry as to whether fire doors, flat entrance doors or external walls are part of the common parts, which at the time would have been in scope of the fire safety order, or whether they are key to an individual demise, in which case it would fall under Housing Act. So the fire safety bill has ensured that this has been redefined, and ultimately it gives the fire service greater enforcement powers when dealing with the external wall and flat entrance doors, and it also makes sure that fire risk assessors under Article 9 of the fire safety order consider both the external wall and flat entrance doors, and we've seen that through the changes to PAS 79 released this year. So the draft building safety bill is introduced for a few main reasons: to secure the safety of people in or about buildings, to improve the standard of buildings, and to improve the competency of people responsible for managing and overseeing building work. It introduces this new term, building safety risk, and that's a risk to safety of persons in or about a building, and that's not just from fire, but also structural failure and any other prescribed matter. So what's a higher risk building? We touched on this. So it's all multi-occupied residential buildings of 18 metres or more in height, or more than 6 stories, whichever is reached first. It's definitely clear from the bill that this has been left open for expansion in the future. And I think it's more a case of, let's not set the building safety regulator up to fail by including all buildings and all complex buildings. Actually, let's get it working now for 80 metres above, and then maybe we can lower that standard to include, for example, multi-occupied residential buildings over 11 metres, which we obviously now include for sprinkler provisions, or more complex sheltered housings that may be low rise. So the building safety regulator under the health and safety executive, I guess we've recognised that they have the expertise and knowledge to drive this regime. They will establish a national register of buildings in scope, and basically they'll have a record of every building over 18 metres that's now under their control. It's really key, and this is different from building regulations in that this piece of legislation is retrospective. So this includes existing buildings over 18 metres and any new buildings. I think that the changes that we're about to discuss are going to have a much greater impact actually on the buildings that already exist, and it's going to be a time now for accountable persons, social housing, people like that to act now and understand what's in their buildings and how to maintain them safely. We're going to ensure that resident complaints are escalated to the regulator and investigated, and I know that Paul will be talking about resident engagement strategies later and what that might look like. So the bill has introduced new duty holders. The duty holders during design, construction and refurbishment are going to be ultimately the client. So that's any person or organisation for whom a construction project is carried out as part of their business. The principal designer and principal contractor, both as appointed by the client under CDM, although their roles will change slightly, and I know that both Mark and James will talk about how this will impact them. And then also designers and contractors. So ultimately anybody managing, controlling, undertaking business within connection to that building. There's going to be changes such as signing a conformity statement at the end of the project, proving that you're competent and proving that the building is able to achieve what's required with current building regulations. They'll be required to cooperate with each other and share information with the building safety regulator. It's going to be moving away from contractors knowing that the situation is not right but doing it anyway because that's what's in the spec. Gateway 2 and 3 is where the client ultimately needs to demonstrate to the building safety regulator that the requirements of the building regulations are met, and this is going to feed into a building assurance certificate, which we'll look at shortly, but it's going to be down to that principal designer, principal contractor role to be able to demonstrate compliance. This is just a real clear map to see what it will look like. So we've got duty holders feeding in at gateway 1 to 3. The developer is going to be responsible at gateway 1. This is going to be when we talk about a fire statement shortly. And then duty holders that we just discussed have legal responsibility during 2 and 3. So it's basically 1 is planning, 2 is during construction, and 3 is prior to occupation. Once that building is occupied, and ultimately prior to that, because it's down to the accountable person to register that building, it will be the accountable person that has the legal responsibility both for registering the building and the building once it's been registered to ensure that the building assurance certificate is in place. The building actually can't be occupied without the certification. What that looks like for existing buildings, it will probably be a case of having a safety case report to justify the mitigations in place. And I guess it almost happens at the moment with the fire service, who would potentially issue a notice of deficiency or enforcement on an unsafe building. If the building is unable to achieve the building assurance certificate, then maybe we would have to look at those sort of steps. So this is going to give greater transparency to occupants. As soon as they walk into their building, they'll be able to see the building assurance certificate. It will tell them who the accountable person is, who their building safety manager is, and ultimately that the building is safe. The accountable person will submit a safety case report on a yearly basis, and that will feed directly into this certificate. This is a document stating that they know what the risks are and this is how they are managed. It will allow us to build more redundancy into the system. For example, considering worst case scenario and implementing systems such as an ATS system. The structural and fire risk assessment should feed into the safety case report. And when Paul touches on building safety managers shortly, and he's thinking about this being developed by a FM style role that may be upskilled, we're then looking at consultancy support to feed into this with the structure and fire knowledge. We're not thinking that a building safety manager can know absolutely everything about a building. So this is just going to show you what it'll look like with the 3 stages. So we've got gateway 1 for planning, and this is the fire statement. So this will be with regards to fire and rescue service access, water supply, and it's to help local planning when granting planning permission. So it's really important to understand that local authority building control will still grant planning applications for buildings in and out of scope, but the building safety regulator will be a statutory consultee for any buildings that are over 18 metres. This is looking at that early engagement to benefit developers. So the fire statement is more like a design and access statement. It's not a fire strategy. It's a concise document that, as I said, is looking at access, water provisions, but also layout implications. So where's this building being built and how is it going to affect surrounding infrastructure, but also how is it going to affect surrounding future developments. It's really important that with regards to development, in scope development actually means a scheme applying for planning which contains at least 1 in scope building. So you're where we now see a couple of low rise, a high rise, all by the same developer, they'll have to consider that development as a whole. So back we've got gateway 1 for planning, gateway 2 is design, and gateway 3 completion stage. I'll allow Mark and James to talk about these 2 areas in a little bit more detail, but ultimately the building safety regulator now will have key stop points. They can actually issue a hard stop if it's not compliant, and if the principal designer and principal contractor are not able to evidence compliance. We've got the building assurance certificate, which we touched on, and that building cannot be occupied unless the building assurance certificate is granted by the building safety regulator. And then the safety case report, which feeds into this year after year. So as I said, the building safety certificate will be displayed in all high-rise buildings, and this ultimately will be a document that's looked after by the building manager. Paul will talk about the building manager role shortly, but it's the accountable person who has the ultimate legal responsibility for that premises. This is most likely the person who owns the freehold, although there may be more than one. They will register the building and apply for the certificate, but they also need to set up this mandatory reporting scheme. And the mandatory reporting scheme will be fed into by the building safety manager, who have to report any structural or fire issues in that building to the building safety regulator. So it's ensuring that the building safety regulator has the oversight of that building and covers all structural and fire issues. Again, just a bit of a simple diagram to help with understanding. So the building safety regulator, away from a joint competency authority, will of course utilise expert knowledge of local authority building control and the fire service enforcement authority. The accountable person has legal responsibility for the building, and they can delegate day-to-day duties to the building safety manager. The building safety manager must be competent to fulfil their role and register with the building safety regulator. The building safety manager must report all safety failings to the building safety regulator and proactively engage residents. And Paul's going to talk about how we're going to give residents a voice. For all new homes, a new homes ombudsman will be set up for builders to register. So all builders of new homes will have to register, and residents will be able to escalate and raise complaints via this route. Residents will also be able to raise complaints with the building manager and the accountable person directly, and this will be given that information via their building assurance certificate. So this is basically just going to go through all the things that Hackett asked for and how we think that the Building Safety Bill has allowed for them. So she's looking for throughout the life cycle of a building, and we can see that that's been introduced via Gateway 1 to 3, which is planning, construction and occupation. Delivery of the new regulator, obviously that's the building safety regulator set up under HSE. Making duty holders more accountable, we're definitely going to see that with the conformity statement signed off at the end of a project. And also mandatory reporting will be brought in for principal designers and principal contractors, and they'll be encouraged to report any structural or fire issues that they can see with a project. Oversight of the safety of all in scope buildings, we'll see this through the National Register of Buildings. Giving residents a voice, Paul will talk about this in more detail, but basically the building manager will be tasked with proactively engaging residents through a mandated resident engagement strategy. This will have to be maintained and relevant for their building. The golden thread of fire safety information. Now, I haven't touched on that because I know that Mark's going to go into a little bit more detail, but the golden thread of fire safety information ultimately needs to be maintained throughout the project. We're talking about from planning through to occupation and yearly via the safety case report. It's building on that Regulation 38 mentality that maybe didn't work so well. It wasn't enforced, and actually in a lot of existing buildings, there are knowledge gaps. I know that now for a lot of housing associations, they're looking to do type 4 or holistic assessments to get that knowledge about their buildings and start building that golden thread of information for existing buildings. There's been a lot of fire door testing, unfortunately, where there was questions in the market about some composite doors and that initial test evidence wasn't available. Some doors have had to be retested where they may have been able to be proven as compliant if that certification was held on file. So we're looking for a much more digital log and ensuring that all information for a building is maintained. Promoting competence across the industry. I mean, we've needed that for years. Specifically, a fire risk assessor before didn't have to have any mandatory skills or training in place, and I know that that's now changing. We're now not just asking for a company to be third party accredited, but also for individuals. There's also competency requirements now for architects, building control, fire engineers, and ultimately anybody working within a building. And then the more stringent regulatory regime, ultimately led by the building safety regulator, with these key steps both at building stage, but once that building is occupied, this safety case report will need to be agreed to on a yearly basis, or the building assurance certificate may be taken away or changed.